Hi and welcome back. This is a very, very late part 2 of Webern, Was He a Nazi? Although it really should be called Webern, Who Was He and Why You Should Care.
If you remember, last time we left off with the ideas of Nazism and we came to the conclusion that at least in the very beginning the Nazis had no specifically clear ideology other than nationalism, and that Webern was very much torn by this, being a musician who really just wanted to write and conduct.
Remember, Webern, though not a Nazi himself, was surrounded by people with many different ideas. His son was a Nazi, but his mentor was a Zionist. And then to top that all off, his music, along with Berg's and Schoenberg's, was denounced as cultural Bolshevism and degenerate art. Those terms are used interchangeably, by the way, by the Nazi Party, which made it much, much more difficult for him to live.
So what exactly is degenerate art? Well, the concept was pretty vague, and a lot of art forms were lumped together because the idea that here to what Hitler thought good nationalist art should be.
Basically, it was any sort of art that was an insult to German feeling, or if it was Jewish, or if it was communist. The Nazi Party promoted art that was most importantly traditional in manner, which, as nationalist as Webern was, and as much as he thought his music adhered to this fact, was not what the Nazi Party had in mind. Art had to exalt the values of racial purity, militarism, and obedience. Music was expected to be tonal, free of jazz influence or rhythms, or Jewishly gloomy lyrics. But according to the Nazi Party, the decay of music was due firsthand to the influence of Judaism and capitalism.
Catherine and I have both dug a lot into music history during this time period. And actually our album 1910-1920 from something like a decade ago reflects our love for this music.
Right, so every time, for the longest time, I would read about the Soviet Union and this word, formalism, kept coming up over and over in reference to Shostakovich and Prokofiev and, well, basically any Russian composer during this period. Khachaturian and Shabalin and Popov, they were all formalists, and I kept on thinking, what the hell is formalism and why can't I find a definition?
Popov. Not Popov.
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 Popov. Popov. Да, конечно.
And the reason is, like cultural Bolshevism, it was kind of a blanket term that covered just about everything the party, either the Soviets or the Nazis, did not think was useful for their propaganda. It was purposefully vague.
Here's a really wonderful quote from Karl von Ossietzky, who was a German journalist, pacifist, and winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, that articulates this very nicely. Cultural Bolshevism is when the conductor Klemperer takes tempi different from his colleague Furtwängler. When a painter sweeps the color into his sunset not seen in Lower Pomerania. When one favors birth control. When one builds a house with a flat roof. When a cesarean birth is shown on the screen. When one admires the performance of Chaplin and the mathematical wizardry of Einstein. This is called cultural Bolshevism and a personal favor rendered to Herr Stalin. It is also the democratic mentality of the brothers Heinrich and Thomas Mann, a piece of music by Hindemith or Weil, and is to be identified with the hysterical insistence of a madman for a law giving him permission to marry his own grandmother.
And there is another quite interesting story. During the war, Webern and his family stayed put in Vienna. Schoenberg's son, Georgy, was taken in by the Weberns and hidden away from the Nazis.
Towards the end of the war, when the Russian invasion was imminent, the Weberns fled on foot to Mittersill, which was about 75 kilometers away. Georgy and his family decided to stay behind in Vienna and wait it out. Ironically, when the Russians did come, Georgy was almost shot for being a Nazi spy because the Weberns' basement was found to be full of Nazi munitions and propaganda that Webern's son, Peter, who was the Nazi, had stored there. Georgy only saved himself from execution by drawing attention to the yellow Star of David that had been sewn onto all of his clothes.
So this is Webern. He was constantly just trying to make his way, and it became very clear, even in his personal records, that it was difficult. In the 30s, it was close to impossible for him to find a job. By 1940, his records show that he was making no money at all. And this always begs the question, why is his music still barely played? I personally think it can be very beautiful, but this music is almost 100 years old now, and we are still saying the same things about it. That it doesn't speak, that it ought to be subject to some sort of ridicule. Does his music really deserve that?
Webern died in 1945, and the terrible thing was it occurred after he stepped out to have a few puffs of his cigar, not wanting to disturb his grandchildren. The Americans who were holding the city at the time had imposed a curfew, although this was 45 minutes before the curfew went into effect. He was shot in the street, there with his cigar.
Before we get too depressing, I do want to look a bit at his music and his influences. Webern only published 31 compositions in his lifetime, though there were many left unpublished from his youth. They are all extremely concise, not a single unnecessary note.
In his earlier years, his style was purely atonal, reflecting Schoenberg's work as his teacher and mentor. But at some point, it seems that Schoenberg might have been just as equally influenced by Webern. Here's a quote of Schoenberg's in a letter to the composer Busoni. "Harmony is expression and nothing else. Away with pathos, away with protracted 10-ton scores. My music must be brief, concise, in 2 notes, not built but expressed. And the results I wish for, no stylized and sterile protracted emotion. People are not like that. It is impossible for a person to have only one sensation at a time. One has thousands simultaneously, and this variegation, this multifariousness, this illogicality which our senses demonstrate, the illogicality presented by their interactions, set forth by some mounting rush of blood, by some reaction of the senses or the nerves, this I should like to have in my music."
Schoenberg was intoxicated with the idea of having liberated music from the shackles of tonality, that now music could renounce motivic features and remain coherent and comprehensible nonetheless.
So Webern, while picking up these ideas from Schoenberg, brought it to his own level, writing themes that were inextricably intertwined with the wars and the search for his homeland, whatever that now was.
The second Viennese school, made up of Schoenberg, Berg and Webern, began to gain popularity after the wars. They came to represent a compelling logical model of new music, and Webern's music began to gain own specific following. As Alex Ross puts it, his music began to reflect a saintly visionary aura.
Webern is an interesting musical figure. For whatever his true political and personal beliefs were, we do know he always believed in the inherent greatness of Germanic art and culture. And for whatever that was worth, he was still treated terribly under the Nazi regime, and his death immediately after the war does nothing to dispel these notions. But his music was becoming an exciting alternative to many young composers, particularly those in the communist bloc.
Even though the war was over, Stalin was still around, and even after Webern's death, composers of Central and Eastern Europe were becoming bored and barred in with those nationalist and traditionalist ideas.
Webern was an influence on Gubaidulina, on Kurtag and Ligeti, and to them the possibilities of this sort of music must have been an overwhelming revelation. I don't know, should we do an episode on the communist bloc? There's so much information out there. Are you interested?
Let us know in the comment section, and if you like this video, give us a thumbs up and subscribe.
And cheers! We'll see you guys next time.